I used to work for the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, and I traveled around about 75 different campuses over 20 years, and very few of the schools invited me back more than once. I'm just kidding. We have a couple. We have a couple of young guys in the class who just brought the age level down by about 35%. Why don't you introduce your sons to their class? This is probably the first time they're here, or maybe not.
Yeah, we've been here a while ago.
Oh, okay.
Alright, so I'm Will.
Just get up and say hello.
Alright, I'm Will Draffin. I'm a senior in high school.
Good.
Yeah, good to be
Thanks.
here.
I'm Ben, his brother, junior.
Welcome. Okay, this is part 2 of a Russia briefing that we're doing. Last week we really focused on the issue of the church, and we focused primarily on the role of Christians in the rebuilding of Russia. And so I just want, for the benefit of these couple of these guys who are new, who were not here last week, and Ann was not here, a couple who are not here, let's tell them what we talked about last week. I'm a college teacher, so I'm going to get you involved. What did we talk about last week? Yes, Kathy.
That the Orthodox Church has a huge amount of power, but people who are associated with the Orthodox Church, a good percentage of them really don't have any spiritual belief.
Okay.
And only about 2% are Catholic and Protestant.
Good. Okay. So we have an environment
Church has
where...
a lot to do with national identity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're going to pick up on that theme, of course, very importantly this morning. So in terms of the larger population, 140 million people, 2% worship on an active basis week by week. 1/2 of those are Orthodox, 1/2 of those are Protestants and Catholics. So in comparison to Western Europe, very low active church participation. But in terms of national identity, we found out with some of the surveys I gave you last week, even 42% of the atheists declare themselves to be Orthodox. It's such an astounding thing you realize. How does that work?
People who are Jewish are also
So for many, to be Russian is to be Orthodox. To be Orthodox is to be Russian. So there's identity there. And part of that identity issue is because under the Soviet period, when there was a downplay of nationalism and talk about internationalism, communism was going to be an international phenomenon. When that thing collapsed, then the question was, what does it mean to be Russian? Where's my identity? What's that mean for me? And so then Orthodoxy steps in to fill that vacuum. Okay, what else did we talk about? Because Ann wants to know what we talked about. Anything else? Yes.
Islam is the fastest growing religion in Russia, which is one of the 2 top concerns, the other being the Chinese borders.
Very good. Well, got some people paying attention. I'm impressed. What else? Yes, I don't know, but,
Well, it's interesting that,
Go ahead.
It's interesting that there's such diversity in the Orthodox Church, and that some even in your schools are going to Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes, yeah. Remember I shared with you the observation by now Patriarch Kirill staff that this Orthodox Church is a very big tent. And we got them on the left, and we got them on the right, and we have them in the middle, and we move very slowly. Yes, Howard.
I wasn't able to come last week, but I have a question for you and for the class members.
Go ahead.
What would you say are 1 or 2 of the most exciting aspects of the Orthodox Church today?
That was not part of my prepared speech. 1 or 2 of the most exciting aspects of the Orthodox Church. I would say, actually 2 related issues. There is a small but slowly growing network of reformist priests, many of whom were disciples of Alexander Min, who was the Billy Graham, John Stott of the Orthodox Church, who was murdered in September 1990 with an axe. But from his blood came a whole group of disciples of his who are doing wonderful things on the parish level all over the Russian Federation. And those are the people that we're working with. They're the ones who are sending the Orthodox students to our university. Other Orthodox churches probably wouldn't get anywhere near us because we've got Protestants and Catholics there as well. But they're more ecumenical in terms of outreach, and so they're willing to step up. So that group, I think, holds some hope for me. Now, under the previous patriarch, he went after some of those folks, Alexei II. He didn't go after the anti-Semites. He didn't go after the monarchists, but he went after some of these young reformist priests. We don't know about the new patriarch, what will happen with him, and how what his attitude will be. But there is a group of these young priests who are saying, we've got to change. And so they are on the parish level, and there's a couple new books out now that are selling very quickly. In fact, it's almost hard to get copies of them now. They're talking about the need to rebuild parish life in Russia. I mean, there is no parish life in Russia. You go to an Orthodox church, you walk in, you worship, and you go back home. Unlike the Catholic and Protestant community. We talked about that last week. But now, for the first time, some of these young priests said, it's important for us to build a parish, to build a community, small groups, Bible studies, reach out in the community. Do things that for us are kind of natural things in the Protestant movement, or the Presbyterian tradition, Catholic tradition, but are not a part of the Orthodox tradition. Those things are starting to happen. And then a second point related to that, Howard, is that a number of those churches now are reaching out to street kids, to orphan programs, food programs, and you start to see some really wonderful ministries, social justice ministries coming out of those churches.
Thanks.
A couple of my staff members go to those churches in Moscow. There's one that has a ministry to terminally ill children in Moscow. And Father Georgi runs a program. A couple of my staff people go over there and help these kids paint and involved in the lives of these terminally ill children. So you see some of that stuff, and that's very exciting to me. Okay, that gives you a little idea what we talked about last week. Last week we talked about the fact that wrestlers is just on the cutting edge here all the time. Last week, Sunday in Moscow, they were appointing Patriarch Kirill, the 16th Patriarch of Russia. He was enthroned, crowned king, made king, patriarch. He is the first patriarch chosen in the post-communist period. His predecessor, Alexei II, who died recently, had been appointed in June of 1990, before the fall of communism. So this is the first patriarch now who was elected since the period of freedom. By the way, I started to feel real old when I looked at this photograph. This man's 3 years younger than I am. Whoa! The issue we want to talk about today briefly is this issue of church-state relationships, and particularly the issue of moral legitimacy. This is the issue I talked about last week, and I want to talk about it again today. And I want to tell you, this is not an issue that you talk about very often with foreign service officers at the U.S. Embassy. Sorry, Clyde. I mean, this issue of spiritual and moral authority and ethical values upon which you want to rebuild society, we've got a lot of, in my experience at the embassy, too many genteel secularists, They don't get involved in conversations like this. But here is a very serious issue, the role of the Orthodox Church. And here's Jim Billington, who is, I consider him one of my mentors. I've read everything the guy's ever written. He's been a friend of our university from the beginning. Whether the Orthodox Church can wrestle itself from the state and become the conscience of the nation will be important in determining whether Russia can discover a new democratic and civil culture, or whether it will return to a dark and threatening authoritarianism. I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know where Patriarch Kirill is going. I know that he was not the candidate that President Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin wanted. They were in favor of the other alternative candidate, Metropolitan Clement. But the Holy Synod chose Kirill instead. And we're going to have to see in the future, and of course for people like us who are involved in ministry in this environment, we're watching this very, very carefully. Now, by the way, part of the reason we're going through this experience is I'm trying to show you, like Restor's class, what it means to apply God's Word to God's world, right? So I'm going to walk you through how we at Raku try and integrate our faith in the context of the Russian environment. We talked primarily last week about the religious context. Now we're going to talk about economic and political context. But it's our effort to try and make our faith relevant to the way we respond in our ministry to this environment. This, of course, is a picture of Kirill with the Prime Minister and the President. There's a very famous quote that came from a 13th century prince, Alexander Nevsky, who defended Russia against the Teutonic Knights who were attacking Russia in the 13th century. And this event is a kind of a fabled event in Russian history. And a great film was made in the 1930s talking about this event. And at the end of this film, Nevsky gets up and says, "Not in might is God, but in truth." Not in might is God, but in truth. And this man, Nevsky, was canonized, made a saint in Russian history. Now the question in my mind is, when Kirill, now the patriarch, takes leadership in the Orthodox Church, what will be his position? Will he take the same kind of posture that Nevsky did, that it's not in political power or in might, but it's in truth that our church has a future? Or will he, as oftentimes has happened in the Orthodox Church over the centuries, become accommodating to political power? The previous patriarch, Alexei II, got the Order of the Fatherland from President Putin a couple of years back. And he was invited to the Kremlin, and he was given this great honor, first-degree award, Order of the Fatherland. And he said, Alexei said, "We educate our believers in the spirit of respect to authority, love of the motherland, and an aspiration to peace and accord." It sounded an awful lot like he was going to use his power to ally himself with the state in that kind of symphonic relationship again. So that's the big question, it seems to me, in terms of what lies ahead here in the future. Now, I want to very briefly just again show you that map that we showed you last week, because we were talking about some of the political and economic dynamics of what's going on here. I just wanted to say real quickly for you, for your information, Marge and I had a chance in 1992 to spend the spring semester in Nizhny Novgorod, which is about 300 kilometers east of Moscow. And we lived there for the spring semester. We were the first American couple ever to live in that city. That was the city of Gorky, where Sakharov was exiled. And it was an extraordinary experience, and that experience, I think, is one of the experiences that broke our hearts. And we lived there that spring and said, we've got to come back here. We've got to make a difference. We've got to play a role here. They were inviting us to come. We need to come. Anyway, I wanted you to see the size of the country again, remind you of the fact that there are 14 neighboring countries on Russia, and just the scale and the scope of this place is just enormous. There are many Russians, thoughtful Russians, who realize that the United States and Russia are both continent-wide, multi-ethnic states, like very few others in the world. So there's a lot we can learn from each other, because there are very few countries like this that have this scale. Russia is almost twice as large as the United States. But generally, in terms of its continent-wide character, its multi-ethnic structure, its diversity, there's an awful lot in common. So there are things that we can learn from each other, some of the more thoughtful people think. And again, I gave you the statistics last week. I won't focus on that very much again, but I do, again, want to remind you of this incredible demographic decline. Many people have said, again, Russia is now the sick man of Europe, and the demographic decline there is just rather extraordinary. And of course, one of the most momentous events in recent history, of course, is this incredible experience of the coup in 1991. And I want to tell you very quickly, I arrived in Moscow the day before the coup. I brought to Moscow 12 American faculty members to be a part of a 2-week-long seminar program on developing an MBA, and got up the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was standing in front of the mirror shaving, and I had BBC out in the background, and I heard him talking about Gorbachev in the past tense. And I said, I think something's wrong. And I went around the hallways to my partner's friends knocking on the door and say, guys, you better get up, I think there's something going on. And he said, come on, Bernbaum, you're playing jokes on me. And of course, we found out that morning that the coup had begun. It was an extraordinary experience, of course. And it was, of course, Yeltsin's just glorious day where he stood up to the coup defenders and basically broke the back of the opposition. It was an incredible experience to be there, and many of the faculty members I was there with were very, very angry at me for bringing them there at that time. And I'm a historian, and I'm sitting there thinking, this is great! Wow, we're right here in the middle, and I'm taking journal notes, and they're going, get me out of here! And of course, we couldn't get out of there, so that was not a possibility. It took us 4 days to make a telephone call to Washington, D.C. I didn't talk to Marge until 4 days later. But it was quite an experience. But, I just want to, again, very quickly talk about the fact that this is such an extraordinary experience the Russians have gone through. It's very hard for us to imagine what this is like in the West. And I've got this wonderful cartoon I got to read to you. It just jumped off the page at me when I saw it. This is a cartoon that came out in 1991. And it's a conversation between a Soviet astronaut and a Russian babushka, a Russian grandma. Okay? But it'll give you a little sense of what we're talking about here. The astronaut says, "Comrade," to the grandma, "I've been in space for a year. It's good to be back in Leningrad." The babushka says, "Sorry, Leningrad is out. This is now St. Petersburg." Babushka, the shocked astronaut replies, "Leningrad is out, but Lenin is the father of communism." Babushka again corrects him, "Sorry, communism is out. We are now capitalists." The astronaut can't believe it and says, "Capitalists? But how could Gorbachev allow this to happen?" The babushka explains, "Sorry, Gorbachev is out. He was overthrown by the hardliners." The astronaut asks confusedly, "You mean the hardliners are in charge?" Babushka responds, "None of the hardliners are out, and Yeltsin took over." The astronaut says, "You mean Yeltsin is the head of the Soviet Union?" The babushka corrects him the last time and says, "No, the Soviet Union's out too." The astronaut yells, "No Soviet Union! Quick! Alert! Call the Warsaw Pact!" Babushkin says, "You and I need to talk." Well, that cartoon just overwhelms you when you begin to think about it. The reality the Russians went through in 91, 92, 93, when everything that they had known absolutely imploded. In a bloodless way. In a totally unpredicted way. There was literally no one in the West, hardly anyone in the West, who ever saw this coming. And to see communism implode in a bloodless format, without war, that empire simply imploded. That's never happened before in modern history, where an empire like this has, of its own weight, simply collapsed. And what we saw, of course, is, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but political revolution, economic revolution, moving back to the borders from the 19th century, imperial revolution. But the ones they hardly ever talk about, of course, are the social and moral aspects of this. All of the family support systems, all the summer camps for kids, all the daycare centers, all the cultural programs, all that stuff disappeared. So families had no social net. So you not only have these dramatic political and economic and social changes, but you've got all the familial breakdown and structure. And then, of course, much less to talk about the moral and spiritual revolution, the emptiness. What fills the vacuum? Right in front of the Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters in Moscow. If you've been to Moscow, you know the little short ring around the Kremlin. And you come up the hill, and here's this altar where Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the secret police, was located. When they removed that famous statue, you probably remember seeing that photograph. The question many of us ask is, whose statue, what god will be placed on that altar to replace that, the god who is now gone? And then, of of course, again, just to help you understand the political and economic context, you've got to think about the chaos of the 1990s. What it was like to live in Russia in the 1990s, where basically by the late 1990s, we were in almost complete anarchy. No one was in charge. It was a country out of control. The conflict that Yeltsin had with the Communist Party leadership and the Duma, which eventually resulted in the attack on the White House in November 1993, and again, I was there for that. It's one of these things, every time I get in the country, something like this happens. And then these two depression types collapses, where currency was absolutely worthless, twice in 10 years. So that everything that you have saved for your life in terms of your pension, and you want to buy a dacha, you want to get an apartment, your savings is completely evaporated once in the early 1990s, and then again in 1998, it happens again a second time. Now think about living in an environment where everything that you own dissolves twice in 10 years. Who do you trust? Can't trust the banks, can't trust the government. All your financial things are gone. Again, I was in Moscow on Black Tuesday in 1998. It was an unbelievable day in Moscow. When they come along and basically say your currency is absolutely useless. I'm sorry. $1,000 note? I mean, it's just not worth anything. Rubles, not worth a thing. And then the anarchy on the street. I was robbed by police at a metro stop in 1995. I was met by two Moscow police who pulled me off on a side street, demanded I open my wallet. I opened my wallet and they took all my money. Walked away. That's what it was like in the 1990s. Right across the street from Tverskaya, which is the principal shopping street in Moscow, where City Hall is located. So you guys got to come here. I got to show you all these places. Where Lenin actually stood out on the balcony and talked to the crowd back in 1917. Right on that square is a little beer garden. And in the summer of 1996, I was running around town and I stopped to have a soda at this little garden and read the newspaper for a half hour or so, and then I left and went on with my business. The next day, right at that spot where I was sitting, were four guys at a table. A black car pulled up. Four guys got out with AK-47s, shot these guys down, got back in the car and rode away, and no one saw a thing. That was 1996, right across the street from City Hall. So do you get an idea of what it was like when Russians think about, democracy, freedom? We've got to think about, you think about Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible and Ivan the Great. Many analysts talk about the fact that really what we got here is Vladimir the Lucky. I mean, this man has to come to power in 2000, but in fact, many of the precedents that began to turn the economy around began in 1998 after that economic collapse. Some bright young economists came in there and began to really tighten the economy up and so forth. And you saw this incredible 10-year period of 7% growth in the economy, year after year for almost 10 years.
Wow.
It's an explosion of this economy. Russian economy becomes one of the 6 largest economies in the world after being in the pits in 1998. Huge foreign currency reserves, some of the largest reserves in the world, the 3rd largest foreign currency reserve in the world. So can you get an idea for Russians why they got so excited about this guy? I mean, here's stability. Here's pride. We can hold our heads up. We've got a lot of things going. So interesting to me, when I was in Moscow during the presidential elections, Russians were so interested in Obama. Fascinated by this guy. But they always kept saying to me, he wants change. It's the last thing we want in Russia is change. Your country's too old. You've gone through too much stuff in your democracy. You need some change maybe, but not here. We want things to be stable. So again, you can see, I think, in that context, that when you talk about passing down leadership, from Putin to Medvedev. This desire for stability is what people want. I've talked to a lot of my young staff members who are wonderful Christian people about their attitudes towards Putin and Medvedev. And I've talked about some of these criticisms you hear about in the West. And they just shake their heads and say, you don't understand. They have brought so much to our lives. We have hope. We've got a future. We hadn't had that before. This is what this country needs. So from a Russian perspective, a very different, contrasting reality. By the way, in 1,000 years of Russian history, there's only been 120 years where they've actually had a normal succession of leadership. Okay? So there's no pattern here, very little pattern of a normal transfer of leadership. It's usually through murder or assassination. Now let's talk about the Russian middle class. This is a dramatic shift, of course, right now. Of course, there's a big debate in Russia about how you define middle class, but most people think about the fact that there's about 25 to 30% of the population now that's the middle class. But again, unlike the West, very different kind of middle class. Because most of these middle class folks that we're talking about in Russia are people who are civil servants or are linked to the state in some way or work for federal security agencies. They're not independent social networks of people. They're largely people dependent on the state itself, and of course that makes a big difference. So a lot of political scientists in the West say what we need to do is we need to have capitalism, because capitalism will generate a middle class, and the middle class then will become owners, and they're going to want to have accountability, and it's going to create a democratic culture. Well, that's always true, except where it's not true. Right? It's not clear here how that's going to happen. Nor is it clear in China, by the way. Despite what you read in the West, as far as I'm concerned. Very interesting survey results, and I got this information on Friday, a briefing that I heard on Friday. Very interesting. Young university students in the 90s wanted to become business majors, entrepreneurs. Our business program took off. It's the biggest program we've got in our university now. Kids want to learn business, in the 1990s especially. But now look what's happened. Now, most university kids from the premier schools in Moscow want to become civil servants. Because of the nexus between power and prestige and money and wealth. They see this connection. And that's where we're going in terms of the countries. Now, again, the economic crisis that we're talking about in Russia is just extraordinary. You think we've got problems in our culture. I mean, the impact in Russia is just really unbelievable. I mean, the Russian stock market has lost 70% of its value. Ever since the war with Georgia, the gas conflict with the Ukraine, and on and on and on, it's been a huge outflow of capital. Just simply vacated out of the country like a huge vacuum cleaner, came along and just sucked up all this money and pulled it out of Russia. So their foreign exchange reserves have dropped, currency devaluation. I wish this would have happened a couple of years ago with trying to build this building. we built the building at the point in which the dollar had the lowest value vis-a-vis the ruble, and now the whole thing is shifting. It would have saved me about $5 million, so I figured, but I'm not going to think about that. And of course, unemployment right now, which is starting to become a very, very significant factor. Some estimates are 10 to 15% of the population will soon be unemployed in Russia. What is this going to mean in terms of demonstrations, so forth and so on? And then the last issue is a very significant one too, because you know, in Russian society, in my experience, and according to the surveys that I read, 3 marks of material success in Russia are you own a car, you own your apartment, and you own a dacha, a little summer house. You got those 3 things, hey, you're doing real well in Russia. You can't get those things now. Consumer credit's gone. Mortgage credit's disappeared. Not possible. Even for my staff. We pay our staff reasonable salaries. Not possible for our staff to get an apartment, to buy a house, to get a car. You can't find credit now in Russia.
Question: what was the nature of that massive capital outflow? That debts coming due, or imbalance of trade, or what made it all
It's a complex one, but I would basically say a lot of foreign investment in the country to help build the infrastructure, the real estate investment that's going on there in Moscow. I mean, every block in Moscow has got massive reconstruction project. A lot of it funded by Western banks. The modernization going on with Gazprom, some of the huge corporations, developing their infrastructure. A lot of that's funded by foreign money. All the foreigners are pulling their money out. They've lost confidence in Russia. And the currency devaluation, by the way, this currency devaluation thing, too, this is another example of this, because it brings back some really negative memories to me. On my last flight home from Moscow 2 weeks ago, I'm on a Delta flight, and we're on the flight, and the stewardess comes down and says, oh, by the way, we'll serve a meal after we take off, blah, blah, blah. Once we're in the air, you can buy beer or wine or alcohol for $7 a piece. We will not accept Russian rubles. The flight's about 90% Russian. I'm thinking to myself, wow, how does that feel? You're a Russian businessman coming to New York to do some business, and you get on an airplane, they tell you, your currency stinks. We're not even going to look at it. Whereas 2 years ago, Putin was going around saying, they have to put the ruble into the world economy basket, because it's one of the strongest economies in the world, one of the strongest currencies in the world. It was. But overnight, it's disappeared. I got to move along. So what's happened politically? What happened politically under Putin, of course, for the first 4 years in particular, all these oligarchs, these wealthy billionaires, were politically neutralized. Putin had a very famous lunch with them in July of 1990, where he got them together in a room and said, hey guys, I'm not going to take away what you have gained if you keep your nose out of politics. You put your nose into politics and we'll come after you. So most of those people became neutral. The several that spoke up are now in jail or overseas. Increasing centralization of power, the vertical of power they talked about. Of course, the TV control is basically state controlled. Opposition has no opportunity to get onto the television in Russia today. So here's the political context. There's a lot of freedom in the print media. You can say whatever you want in the print media in Russia. There are hundreds of newspapers in Moscow, St. Petersburg, all over the country. So you can say what you want in the print media, but of course that has very little influence overall in terms of the country. The mass media, the television media, is basically controlled by the Kremlin. NGOs, non-government organizations, of course, are under increasing control. Organizations like ours that get any kind of foreign support are being watched very carefully by the tax police. And then, of course, recently, some of the murders of journalists and others, it's a bloody record. And then, of course, tremendous restrictions on political opposition as well. So, how does Raku operate in this environment? How do we attempt to live in this kind of a world? And how does we think about the way in which our faith gives shape to our response? This is, of course, a photograph of our students at a fall retreat, and that's the new building, which is still 96% complete. It may be 96% complete in another 6 months, but we're going to keep trying to get it done. But we made a decision early on in our ministry that what we needed to be involved in was to basically raise a generation of young Russian Christians who were a very different kind of people. We wanted to give them the kind of moral character development which would allow them to become future leaders of the country. We wanted to give them the competence, the skills in computers and in language and in business and in social work and in linguistics so they could emerge as some of the future leaders of the country. And we wanted to ground them in a Christian world and life view. Now we thought in some ways it's a little bit like throwing a little bit of sand into a situation. We're a small university, a small ministry in a very large place. But we thought instead of just complaining about corruption and the problems in Russia, someone's got to start to do something, right? So let's at least begin to make this kind of an impact. There are as I mentioned last week, about 125 Bible colleges, Bible institutes, and seminaries in Russia. Many of them are struggling to survive. But there are no other liberal arts universities to train laity. So our vision was to come in and be an equiper of the laity to help Christians emerge from these different traditions Second principle we've talked about is trying to teach and practice religious freedom, conscience, and thought. So we thought we would build a university that would invite in Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox students to learn to respect each other, to learn from each other, to build on each other's traditions. So we bring in speakers and teachers from these different traditions, and it's really amazing. Again, I mentioned last week that we had an Orthodox priest in about a month ago who gave this wonderful evangelical sermon to our students, and the Baptist kids, it blew them away. They had never heard anything like this, because they had the stereotype in their mind of what Orthodox was like. And this guy comes in sounding like the Apostle Paul, and they just couldn't believe it. We've had the same thing happen with a local Catholic priest who's become our friend. God, he's absolutely committed to Christ. And it was just beautiful to have these kids come in and begin to realize that they can learn from each other in these different traditions. So we talk a lot about this idea of having this ability to respect each other, to learn from each other, and to have freedom of thought. And then again, to try and work cooperatively across these denominational lines, across these communities. Many Protestants within the Russian context don't talk to each other. Baptists don't talk to Charismatics, they don't talk to Mennonites, we don't talk to Pentecostals. If they drink tea or don't drink tea, go to soccer games or don't go to soccer games. These are all decisions whether they're in and out of the kingdom. And what we're trying to say is we got to get over that stuff, folks. We're 2% of the population. If we're going to make any difference in the name of Christ, we've got to find some ways to work together. So that's what we're trying to do at our university. So that's our effort to wrestle with applying God's Word to God's world. And then I also want to put on the table, if you'd like, I got plenty of time for conversation now. If you want to have a conversation about how Raku might fit into NPC's missions program as well, we can discuss that. Okay, friends. I've got a lot more to talk about, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. So any questions or comments? Yes, Howard, I would have guessed.
I think this is great. I guess there's one thing behind all this that didn't come out terribly clearly, and maybe I have it wrong, but I think most of Putin's economic background was oil and gas. In other words, Russia's a monoculture. Its financial picture, which becomes very bright in the late 90s and is now receding, has everything to do with oil and gas sales, export sales out of Russia. Am I correct on this?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's something I think you have to understand, just how fragile these people are. And the other thing that came out at me was the number of Russians that are now in the world, and it's 140. This is about the size of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And that's the way it seems. That's the way it seems things are heading in that direction. Because what is going to take the place of valuta, that is the capacity to earn hard currency in Russia, once the oil and gas is gone? And that's a very fragile thing.
Yeah.
I think. Am I basically online with your?
No, I think that's right. And one of the great debates going on I think in the Kremlin right now is this issue of, do we withdraw to kind of a fortress Russia mentality, because the West is to blame for this crisis. They did it to us, not our fault, and now we're suffering. So how do we handle it? One way to handle it is to become kind of a fortress of Russia and rely even more heavily than we have in the past on the petrochemicals. They need our oil, they need our gas. Let's make that become part of who we are.
The technology that comes from the West.
Yeah, but that's part of the mentality. There are other young, called liberal economists, who are basically saying we've got to diversify this economy. We can't keep living like this. And Kudrin, who continues, I can't believe this guy still is in that cabinet, continues to basically say this is the approach we've got to have. We've got to get integrated in the world economy. We can't withdraw. We can't become a fortress mentality. We've got to be involved in these things, and we've got to diversify. And information technology and computers, where we got to go. And this Medvedev, of course, the president, the young president, that's a big theme with him. So this is the debate that's going on. I mean, it's a good guy, bad guy debate, as far as I'm concerned. It's the heart, the soul of what's involved in the country.
It's an old debate. Not love versus Westernovich.
That's part of it. That's right. Yes.
With the rapidly declining population, growth of the older sector of the population rapidly, what's the government doing to try to do, if anything, to try to reverse that or to at least halt it?
The government's doing a couple things. They're not doing much. But they're doing a couple of things. I mean, I just want to go on a side road just for a second on that whole related HIV/AIDS thing, which is a phenomenon. The Russians, the government's going, that's not our problem. That's Africa's problem. That's India's problem. That's China's problem. But we don't have that problem here. Well, of course, you've got a very serious HIV/AIDS problem in Russia, but they're ignoring that. But in terms of the population, they're doing two things, basically. They're not doing much, but they're doing two things. They put in place a special benefits program. If you have more than a couple kids, you get an additional ruble allowance from the government. And that's encouraged some families to have additional children. But it's a very modest increase in compensation, a stipend, basically. And they are encouraging immigration of Russians from neighboring cities to come back to the country. And they're opening up and encouraging immigration of Russians from the former republics to come into Russia. They have to have a workforce. They're going to be in serious trouble within a decade or two in terms of not just a young adult workforce. And so they are loosening up visa requirements now for people from their neighboring republics to encourage them to come back into the Federation. For people in the West, for many of us who watch this thing, we don't think their response is anywhere in relationship to the crisis they're facing. I mean, most of the people who watch this, we've got some friends at Georgetown, at George Mason University who are following this, and we're saying, you got a problem here, folks. You better get on this thing quick. And it does not seem like that administration is paying appropriate level of attention to that situation. Yes.
Addressing the issue of your talk this morning on how Christians make a difference in Russia, and how you train your students. One of the things that my group has found in working with Armenia and Moldova is the issue of sacrifice, which is to say, when you talk about civil society, or can you hear him? No, I'll speak up a little. Speak up. Touching upon the central sort of theme that you're presenting to us today, which is how do Christians make a difference in Russia, or how does Reichu make a difference in Russia? One of the issues that the groups that I work with deal with is the issue of sacrifice, which is to say, when you help people over there understand the value of making ethical decisions in a corrupt society, there's an issue of there's a cost to it, and there's a question of, well, what do you advise people to do in terms of the sacrifice that that they should be willing to make to help their society grow or improve? Well, obviously, sacrifice is an individual issue. And of course, in a situation like Russia has with all these difficult economic problems, you can start sacrificing pretty fast. So when you talk to your students about the value of making Christian ethical decisions, what advice do you offer them about their willingness or ability to sacrifice? How much risk do you suggest they take?
This is a very important issue, and this is an issue that always causes me a lot of internal struggle. Part of it is because the way in which my pattern of my life right now. I mean, I spend 30% of my year in Moscow and 70% here in the States. So I'm not there full time. I'm in and out. I've been doing that for 18 years. So I realize that in my own work with the university, I don't have the same kind of total immersion in this totally corrupt culture that my own staff does, and that most of my people that I'm related to have. And so I'm very hesitant to give too much counsel on how to deal with corruption, because I'm on the edge of it. I don't live with it like they do every day. So that causes me to be always a little hesitant about how much can I really say to them about how to get through this stuff. But on the other hand, what we decided to do, and what I decided to do in terms of our ministry, is I decided to make our university an open book to our students and to our staff. So when I go there, I use my chapel times as an educational moment. And it gets my Russian staff, a little nervous sometimes, but I don't worry about that. I tell the kids what's going on. And I tell them about how we're struggling with some of these issues, and how we're not going to compromise in terms of integrity and paying bribes. I mean, this current situation that we have with our educational license. These kids know that for $10,000, that problem would go away. And I'm not paying $10,000 to make that problem go away. And I'm going to tell them that. And I'm going to say to them, you're going to suffer for the next 2 months because we can't do normal classes here because of some stupid bureaucrats who are trying to hold us up.
We might lose our university.
We could lose the school. But we're not making that compromise. So I have used that pattern from the first day we started our school. So I try and do that. I try and say to them, this is what, there's another way to live. We can choose to live a different way. And we're going to pay a price for what we do. Get used to it. But that's what it means to live a life of integrity, I think. And so I try and use examples from other environments to help them understand that and so forth. But it's a tough struggle. Many of my Russian trustees would just as soon pay these guys off and get this thing done. I mean, they've learned to make the compromise. They've been in that environment and they said, hey, you know, this is what you got to do, you got to do it. So get on with it, you know, pay them off and let's get going. And I've said to them, you know, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to go that way. We had a couple of questions here. Let me come back. Clyde, and then we'll go over here and then we'll go here.
A comment and then something that relates to your slide. First, I think the difference between Russia and Nigeria, huge differences. But Nigeria, you remember, had a big oil gas run, mainly oil, and turned into a criminal state when the price went down, because all it did was train a class of people on how to interrelate with the world and how to exploit connections and power. Huge difference between Nigeria and Russia, and we need to mention, I think, is that you've got a degree of literacy, education, achievement in science. You've got the nuclear armaments issue. And so I think we have to recognize that difference. Now, to this issue here, when there was this first opening back 18 years ago, I remember even a woman that I think was on your board then, who was a lawyer, who had set up an NGO to help organizations on legal and ethical issues. She was giving guidance to NGOs. And I'm curious whether or not you could say something about those kind of activities to the extent to which they still prosper, because that would create another nexus between people in our church and people that you relate to there in Moscow, which would be, you know, even beyond the Raku. I remember Dick Manthey, for example, who was active back then through Campus Crusade in talking to universities, to law schools, about the normative basis of our legal system.
Yeah. Katya Smyslova still has her Esther Legal Center going. And there's also another fellow named Untitled Chapter who has a Slavic Law Center, Legal Center, that's also committed to help religious organizations get legally registered, stay within the law, and be an advisor to nonprofit corporations, particularly Christian organizations. So yes, those networks are there, and we are involved with those folks. They are on my board. Both those people are on our boards. They're both pressing us real hard to develop a law school. That might be the next president's job. So that's an opportunity they feel very strongly about. That we've got to have jurists, we've got to have advocates who understand the character of law and can protect religious freedom. They play very, very important roles in defending religious organizations, and they were the ones who stood with the Salvation Army. You know, were convicted of being a foreign military force. 4 years in court, they were vindicated, you know, but tied them up for 4 years. So they're the ones that play that kind of role. And yes, we are involved with folks like that. We talk about them, we bring them into our class to talk about examples in chapel. We try and provide them with internship support. That's a very important part of our life right now. Those organizations are absolutely vital, because outside of the principal centers like in Moscow or St. Petersburg, well, there's a frame of reference of a rule of law. There's some semblance of law in that. You get outside the city into the provincial cities, who's ever in charge. And you've got to be able to bring a legal presence with you into those places, otherwise you don't have a chance. That answer your question, at least in part?
Now, I was trying to put that into how NPC could relate to RACU.
Yeah.
Yes, supporting a school that maybe seeing a ministry connection with some of the groups you relate to.
Well, again, I think, if I'm hearing your question correctly, what our sense would be, and this is where the connection, I think, to NPC, it could be a magnificent one, is that let me go back a step. When we started the university, when we were first invited to come in, we were invited to establish a Russian university. So we came in there with the idea, we're going to spend 5 to 7 years here, get this school started, and John Bernbaum's going to go back home and just live a normal life. But the first time we had the board meeting of trustees, the board said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to just have a Russian university. We want to have a Russian-American Christian university. So for decades to come, we'll have this cultural bridge between these two cultures. And you can move ideas and resources and people back and forth. And we know now that we're going to get most of the benefit from the West is going to come in our direction, but over a couple decades, we hope it'll be a mutual cross-fertilization and so forth. So that's what we did. We tore the charter up, renamed the school Russian American Christian University, bicultural, binational school, with the idea in mind that regardless of the politics of relationships between these two countries, there would be this bridge between the Christian communities. And we could move people back and forth to help and build each other up. And so that's where I think the relationship between NPC and RACU could be really a profitable one. It'd be great to have lawyers and business people and social workers and teachers from this culture come there, have them come over here, visit our, experience our culture, have that cross-fertilization, do art displays, do music programs, all kinds of opportunities for cultural exchanges, people-to-people relationship building. I mean, part of the vision, of course, for us is this shalom making. We're in the shalom making business. We're in the people-to-people business. And so that's part of our dream. And I think that Nashville could be a beautiful resource because, there are a lot of other important ministries, but they're maybe not very good fits. Whereas this is a capital relationship with a lot of people who have experience in public policy and in education. It could be a really great. Now I got so many questions here. I don't know where we're going to go. Let me go here next. I'll come to you, Mary. And then Chuck, go ahead.
This question addresses the NPC missions program. And it's a broader question than related to RACU only, but I think RACU is a remarkably successful program related to NPC's mission programs. I know that you're broader support than just NPC. However, the question I have is, what has been the impact of RACU and perhaps other mission programs back on NPC? Now, I know that you have you've encouraged many individual kinds of opportunities for NPC members to travel to Russia, to get acquainted with, educated about Russia. But what has been the impact on the priorities of NPC, of the vision of NPC? We've had, since you started, we've lost identity for outreach, and missions has been folded into service. So we used to have 4 pillars, and now we have 3. Our current budget, $159,000 for missions. $150,000 of that comes from a designated trust. So we have $9,000 coming in from faith giving. We no longer have a mission council. What is happening to mission programs overall, and how do you see it as someone who's had a major mission program in terms of what's happening to the priorities of missions at NPC? Are we any more toward an international Presbyterian church, or are we still just a national Presbyterian church?
Step right up.
I'm asking is, how do you see it?
Careful. I got to be real careful. Yeah. I used to work in the State Department, but I only stood there 4 years and I left. I wasn't diplomatic enough, so I decided I got to go. Oh boy. Well, let's just have a conversation about that together. I'll say a couple things. I'll give you a couple observations. I'm frankly distressed about the way in which we handle missions in this church. I mean, I can't believe the way we don't underfund missions. in the life of our congregation. The most recent conversation at the congregational meeting made that so clear. I mean, this is a minuscule missions budget. I realize we have a lot of other financial challenges in our church, and maintenance of the facility and all that kind of stuff. But that is no reason to me to downplay or minimize the kind of missions investment. I don't know how we walk away from our responsibility to be globally engaged in terms of what God's doing worldwide. But my problem is that because I'm obviously involved in this, I'm not a neutral observer. I have to be very careful about what I say. But I have a hard time not biting my tongue on most of this stuff. And I have the same struggle when I travel across the country. 3 weeks ago, I was out in California visiting a couple of these huge mega churches. $45, $50 million campuses. I mean, some of these churches were like a college campus. I mean, huge, 7, 8 facilities, $50 million. And what are they doing with their missions budgets? And I keep thinking to myself, when we stand before the Lord, and He says to us, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. What did you guys do to help educate the next leadership in Africa and Asia, Eurasia? Oh, we were building church buildings. We wanted to have gymnasium for our kids and special sports programs, and so we built a $50 million campus. I mean, we got a lot of accountability going on. I read a number the other day. I asked the guy who wrote the number to give it to document it, and he couldn't. He just threw the number out. He said he saw a number someplace that said that we currently have in the United States $300 billion in endowed building budgets in churches in the United States. $300 billion in endowments for buildings in the United States. Now again, I asked him to document it. He couldn't give me a source. I mean, if that's anywhere near that, what a travesty. What are we doing? Building buildings when there's huge, evident world need all over the place for leadership, for training, for raising up a generation for the future. It breaks my heart. So that's the bigger picture. So we'll bring it back to our place. I mean, I think it's a very serious issue in terms of the life of our congregation. Now, I'm feeling right now that there's a whole new spirit at NPC. I think things are really turning around this place. And last night was so much fun. Well, there's a splendid thing. I mean, there's a lot of energy here now. And I'm hoping that we can begin at some point soon with Earl's prodding, or maybe some others, to begin to turn this thing around in terms of how we prioritize missions.